Thank you for the introduction. I think I speak loud enough.
You can hear?
Yes.
Yes.
Otherwise you tell us.
As a teacher in law for the last 52 years, I have been used to addressing class of 100 students or even more. So I speak very loud, which is one of the requirements for a teacher to be effectively heard in the class. So I have no difficulty in speaking in as high a volume as usual, even without mic. I have been closely watching the activities of this group, which the Public Policy Research Group, which includes a couple of students of mine in the law school at Bangalore. So whenever they organize some program and ask me to participate, I try to find time to come at least for a session during the program. And this time, Ms. Mathu informed me that many of you are guests from different countries and are actively involved in public policy area. I thought that interaction with you will be a learning experience for me as well. But he didn't tell me exactly as to what I should focus on, excepting that he would like me to speak on judicial impact assessment and research on judicial impact assessment. But later on this morning he told me that there are some people who would like to know about the constitution making process in Nepal and some of the critical issues on which differences have arisen in the Constituent Assembly. And if you can reflect on that also, it would be good. I told them that maybe that you might raise any of the issue that you might like me to discuss about, and to the extent that I am capable of, I would add my comments, and thereby we can make the session interactive, whatever you are expecting. Otherwise, I'll begin with impact assessment and how does one go about researching law impact assessment or judicial impact assessment. I like to speak on that because few years ago, the Indian Supreme Court directed the Government of India to make a study on judicial impact assessment, evolve a methodology therefore, and adopt that while making laws in future. What was the provocation? The provocation was that the Indian Parliament and Indian legislatures, like many other countries, have been putting any number of laws in the statute book. Every session will have a dozen or more legislations, and these, many of them half-baked legislations, but they create rights, they create obligations, they create new institutional mechanisms, they expect people to conform their behavior to the requirements of that law. Some of them are criminal laws, some of them are civil laws. So too many laws have been enacted by the legislature. That is their function. So they do it. As a result of which, the workload of the courts, the judiciary, has been consistently increasing. When you create more rights and the rights are violated, people naturally go to the court for relief. Or when you make law which are controversial, people will challenge the constitutionality of those laws. Anyway, the work of the court on the constitutional side, on the civil side, on the criminal side, kept on mounting with increased number of laws being passed by the legislatures at the federal level, at the state level. And at the same time, when the judiciary asked the executive to increase the number of courts, appoint more judges, which cost money, the executive has been reluctant. So therefore, the judiciary, on a petition filed by a public interest case, directed the government, look, when you make more laws,
take care of the increased workload that the legislation will create to us, the judiciary, and provide appropriate funds in your financial memorandum attached with the legislation. That means before every law is passed, the executive has to assess what would be the additional petitions, litigation that it might raise, and how many additional hours the courts will have to work to resolve those grievances. How many more judicial hours? How many more judges may be required to process those litigations? And this will have to be converted into rupee and provided in the financial memorandum. Means every new law, a certain amount of money will go to the judiciary for addressing the new litigation that the new legislation will generate. Now, when the direction came from the Supreme Court to the Government of India, the Government of India felt, how do we calculate? This is a futuristic exercise. How do we know that this legislation is going to create X number of cases? How do we know that each case will take Y number of judicial hours? This is something which need to be calculated by some quantitative methods of assessing the additional workload. So what usually when a problem like this arises in the administration, the government appoints an expert committee to provide a methodology by which the impact of new legislations on the judicial workload can be calculated and appropriate finances provided therefore. So in that committee, a retired Supreme Court judge was appointed as chairman, and among the other 3 members, I happened to be a member of that committee. So we sat down and discussed. We said, how do we calculate? Any idea from your side? If you are a member of the Judicial Impact Assessment Committee, to tell us how much new legislation, new litigation that the legislation will create, how many more courts would be needed to deal with the litigation arising from that legislation. What would be your response? Anyone? Anyone has a methodology, please?
Well, it would be very tough, but one thing to figure out can be look at the past legislation which was created recently and how much workload it has created on judiciary, and that can be only a base, but
past legislation of a similar kind.
Of a similar
kind.
Yes.
I wonder, suppose if India recently passed a legislation called Domestic Violence Act,
Right.
which created certain rights on the part of women who are victims of domestic violence or children to go to court for relief. Either to the criminal court if it is serious, the civil court compensatory reliefs. Now, we are told in many societies, particularly Kerala, but in certain other societies different. India is a multicultural society. If you go to the northeast, I am told that women there are more powerful than men. And men have to obey what the women direct. With the result, if at all there is a victim of domestic violence in northeast, it ought to be perhaps men rather than women.
Yes.
There are many other matrilineal or matriarchal societies wherein women are. Suppose if you come to a state like Kerala, in the middle class, in the upper classes, you will find women are well educated. They are economically independent. They don't have to suffer domestic violence. They can seek relief, they can hire lawyers and things like that. Whereas you find in the lower classes, almost women are routinely victimized by their husbands. Now if you go to the rural areas in other parts of India, the situation may be changing. Now you are passing a legislation for the whole of India. you don't have a similar legislation. You have a Dowry Prohibition Act. You have a Sati Prohibition Act. But on domestic violence, excepting the Indian Penal Code, which prosecutes person for hurt, grievous hurt and things like that, you don't have a scenario in which, there is a cultural, I don't know, you might have noticed it, a cultural environment in which women are supposed to take in her stride a little violence that happens in a home. It's a cultural conditioning of women that you are going to your husband's house. The husband is the Lord. He is the breadwinner. You have to obey him. Your function is in the kitchen. He is mending the children and serving your husband. And if you do that, you will get salvation when you die. A sort of conditioning, I am overstating this, but particularly, I don't know, in different societies it may be different, but in male-dominated societies, where you find the laws are male-made for men. This is laws made for men, implemented by women, implemented by men, enforced against women. Whatever it be, so there is a cultural conditioning. Now in Domestic Violence Act, according to what you said as to how much cases a past legislation has generated, is no guide for projecting a reasonable, you cannot just make a wild guess. That will not be legislated. So you must have some empirical evidence to substantiate your claim that this would generate in the first year X number of cases, second year X, Y number, third year another, a progression. So therefore, we were in search for any other method. Anybody else have a method in mind? Do you think that Parliament in your country is passing legislation without any concern for how much cases it will generate and not providing for it in the judiciary? Or will they provide some money for the judiciary when they legislate?
In our country there is an impact assessment. You have to write a lot of things here, but usually it's not done in a very good manner. They just write something there and don't really care about it. So there is no real impact assessment. This is one of the problems, because there is also not legal impact assessment. There should be also economical impact assessment, intended consequences, unintended consequences. They should be there, but nobody really cares about it. That is a problem.
Very good. That is, he has qualified it. There is an economic impact assessment. There is a social impact assessment. There is a legal impact assessment. So impact is not only unidimensional. We are now talking about economic impact assessment. How much more money you need to provide for implementing that legislation. Usually when a legislation is passed, there is a financial memorandum which the minister attaches with the bill. That financial memorandum is supposed to calculate the cost for implementation. Usually what they calculate is the executive cost. That means the executive branch of the government will have to appoint X number of clerks, secretaries, directors, this, that, and they create so many prisons, so many brothels, hostel schools, this, that. So many institutions, their cost. But court, they don't calculate. With the result, you will find the judiciary has an overload of work, tremendous arrears, long pendency. People are not getting justice. There's a hue and cry. Are the judiciary the villains? Certainly not. The judiciary has not been provided with necessary wherewithal to address the issues that have been thrown up by the an overactive, proactive legislature trying to please the people because they are politicians in parliament. So they want to tell the people, look, we put an end to domestic violence act, domestic violence. We passed the legislation. So please, women, vote for us. Without regard to the judiciary. So the problem is there. As he says, maybe that you don't take care of it. Do you think there is a felt need for an impact assessment, economic impact assessment, to address the judicial workload? This was the matter which in the Indian Supreme Court they felt it necessary. Your financial memorandum should have it, and therefore directed, the committee was there and we were deliberating. We decided, because we ourselves are ignorant about the methodology, to ask some of the social scientists, experts like you, political science, economics, sociology, anthropology. These people have social science research methods. They quantify things with the use of statistics. They can project to the future as well. For example, one of the interesting things which came submitted to us, how does the Hyundai or the Toyota people calculate how many cars will be sold if a new model is introduced in India? Or how can the model be made attractive? What the people in India, the car buyers, are looking for when they want to buy a new car, accepting cheap price. So there is some methodology. We may call it operational research or marketing research or whatever it is, by which future impact of a certain action can be assessed. So it is not that there is not known tested research methods available. So here we have suggested to a group of economists and behavioral scientists to tell us a methodology. And this is the report of the Judicial Impact Assessment Committee, which has provided half a dozen different methodologies. And we said that there is no one methodology, but there can be different types of methodologies according to different situations. You can have one of them or a combination of them, which may be giving you some guideline as to how you might quantify the judicial workload when a new legislation or an amendment of the legislation is introduced. I'll give you an interesting example. We have a legislation called Negotiable Instruments Act. Under that Negotiable Instruments Act, people used to take loan from banks and other places, and many of them were not returning the installments. Usually when you do not return, the debtor is not returning to the creditor, the bank usually have to file a suit in a civil court. It takes its own time, taking of evidence, and finally a decree, then an appeal. So we had, the government had asked our banks to give liberal loans for different purposes. Banks have given, and then they found that lot of non-performing assets. Now a lot of people not returning it. So banks employed two methods. One, filing the cases in the civil court, knowing fully well the next 10 years it will be lagging in the civil court. The other method they employed is to employ certain goons, these mafia people, who will threaten, assault, and get the money from the bank. That created law and order problems. So there was pressure on the legislators to find another method. That method was that the function that is being done by these mafia gangs be given to the policemen. So they criminalized. If you do not pay the bank loan installments, the bank will have a right to make you an accused, file an FIR, and then the police will take over so that you don't have to employ. The police will prosecute the debtor and prosecution will take him to jail and you might get back your money. What happened with this was a small amendment to the Negotiable Instruments Act, whereby unpaid debts of this nature were made criminal offences. Believe me, you, within a span of 6 months, 25 lakhs of criminal cases were filed in Indian courts. Banks were happy because their loan collectors are now the state-appointed policemen. They have no expense. Many people had to go to jail and consequences followed. But in the process, our courts have been burdened with 25 lakh cases by a small amendment to a legislation. And the court turned and asked the parliament, what did you do? We are already burdened with so many criminal cases. Now with a small amendment, you have made our work 5 times more without making any provision for an additional court or an appointment of a judge. No money for the judiciary. You shall not do it. You must make a judicial impact assessment, provide the money therefore when the amendment or the new bill is passed, and if you don't have a methodology, find out a methodology. That was the context in which this is a very real problem, live problem. So you have a situation like this in which the impact assessment can be made in one of several methods. I am not going to discuss in detail because it's too complex. Quantification of data by statistical analysis is something which only social science research method experts will be able to do. But I am just submitting to you half a dozen methods. Survey method is one. The National Sample Survey, the National Health Survey, every year about the incidence of diseases to the people in the country, there is a survey that is being done in order to provide appropriate medical benefits for them. So therefore the methodology is known. Well, coming back to research in law, at least in this country, we have long been doing legal research, taking law as an autonomous discipline. Law is an autonomous discipline, and the methods of legal research have to be found by legal materials within the realm of law. And what are the legal materials? They are the laws passed by Parliament, the rules and regulations which are adopted under that law. This is one set of materials, statutory. The second set of materials are the cases decided and the interpretation given by the courts, the judicial decisions. That's the other material. And if necessary, the third and last material by and large is the legislative debate in Parliament when the law was passed, so that you have some idea what were the intended objects. Very occasionally, marginally, you might take the help of commentaries by experts on these various statutes. So these were the primary and secondary sources for legal research, nothing more, nothing less. We never acknowledge that survey or interview or participant observation or quantification of data, etc. are at all necessary for legal research. So we call this conventional method of legal research, which still dominates the field, as doctrinal research. Whereas of late a change has happened. How did the change happen? The change happened because the demise or the challenge to the analytical school of jurisprudence. You know, those who have studied political science, legal history will know that the liberalism that prevailed in England in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, which has manifested across all disciplines or fields of knowledge. That was the time Adam Smith and Ricardo propounded the economic theories. You have Rousseau, Locke and others, the political philosophies. You find that across the globe, the analytical method, the hedonistic calculus, the idea that man is motivated, his behavior is motivated by having more pleasure and avoidance of pain. So if you have to have a legislation and you want a particular behavior for the people to follow, then you increase the pain that a person might derive by doing a particular act which is forbidden. Pleasure and pain, and calculating it will decide as to whether a law should have a particular punishment or not. Macaulay's Indian Penal Code was drafted on this principle of pleasure and pain. This is the theory that is known in philosophy as hedonism, hedonistic calculus. Anyway, that was the understanding of human behavior in the 17th, 18th centuries. But today we know man is motivated by a variety of other factors, not necessarily, even pleasure and pain. What is pleasure to you may not necessarily be pleasure to me. Is committing suicide brings pleasure or pain to the person committing suicide? Any idea? Have you analyzed it? Why do people commit suicide? If you want to pass a legislation in your country to prevent suicides, what will be the law that you will make? Anyone? Is there suicide in your country, madam? Yes. Why do people commit suicide? To get good pleasure?
They will end of the pain.
Huh? To get rid of the pain. That is, to get rid of the pain is deriving pleasure. So if you commit suicide to get rid of pain,
Once he's gone, he can't experience the pleasure. Once he's gone, he can't experience the pleasure.
he can't experience the pleasure anymore, yes. But a temporary pleasure, momentary pleasure, is what pushes him to take away his own life. Is that one theory? In our country this question arose, and then the Macaulay Court said, if you commit successfully suicide, no offense. But if you attempt and be unsuccessful, then we will prosecute you and put you behind bars. See, it's a funny law, is it? But that's the law. That's the law we have. So why do you make such a funny law? Does it prevent suicide? Does it prevent suicide? After all, passing a criminal law, the objective is prevention of crime, deterring people from committing crime. So do you think that attempt to punish being made a crime, attempt to commit suicide being made a crime, does it prevent people from committing suicide?
I don't think so.
No, yes,
Because while you are committing suicide, and if your attempt is not good, and you see that other people saw you, you think that you need to die now before you are
Otherwise, you'll be prosecuted. Yes.
Yes. So it's a motivation to succeed with the suicide.
That's right. So this, I don't know why people make such a law. Because nobody is deterred from committing suicide by the fear that if he is unsuccessful, he might land up in jail. So if that is the case, what do you think? Why should we have this law of people should have freedom to commit suicide? Would you recommend a law which allows freedom to people to commit suicide?
I mean, this
status quo is freedom to do that. In my country, there is no law with suicide. There is no law which is related to suicide. I mean, people, of course, there are some programs which which allow people psychological help and all this kind of stuff, but there is no law, no punishment law here, because there is no object for that. I mean,
Yeah, there is no purpose served by having an anti-suicide law. Is it the whole group is of the same opinion? No country should have an anti-suicide law.
I think yes. No country should have a law in society.
And
Yeah, the only thing is probably, for example, there are some religious sects where people go and because they go there and they jump from, for example, buildings and then they commit suicide, but there is a reason behind that. Not that they had a pain and they wanted to relieve it, but that there was a religious motivation. So maybe this kind of things
if
might
it is
be
part of one's faith, then it's a matter of religious right. Well, that is another possible interpretation, wherein he doesn't see the role of law in it. Should religion allow that? Is there any religion which persuades you to commit suicide? Which? Japanese I also.
Yeah, once I also read about group suicide. So,
Yeah, yeah.
which also had happened in Japan. So,
The point is that, this is again question of law impact assessment. When you pass a law, should it be a moral code? Life is precious. Everybody has right to life. And your life is precious not only to you, but to the society as well. So don't take away your life because you owe it to a society to maintain your life. So taking away your life is sin, is violation of social norms, is doing an affront to the society or community you live in. If you were to cultivate that, you will say that, well, up to this education, teaching is okay, but then the law comes in at that time to legislate on this moral code into a legal code. There you are expressing doubts whether, because it doesn't serve any purpose, and prosecuting people who are unsuccessful at suicide is double victimization. So therefore, let us not do that. It's quite interesting if you look into the various behaviors that are prohibited. Tobacco or drug is harmful to life, health. So should law prohibit smoking? No? Which is harmful to your life, to your health, your life.
Everything's
not the state.
Driving is also harmful.
Yes, harmful things should be prohibited, right?
yes. No. Why possible?
Then why is the necessity of law? If you are good to know what is good for you, then why do you need law at all?
well, it's a problem of this of moral rules, because a lot of them are contradictory. For example, we see as moral a free, if I'm free to choose something which I want to do, that's also could be a value for me. And then this norm or this value is against what you say when there are some kind of things. Basically, my value is that I am able to choose something. This is one value. Another value is that people should not do things that harm them. So basically, in this case, these two norms are contradictory.
No, it could be contradictory, but the point is that your choice is conditioned by similar choices of others living in the community. Your freedom is limited by the freedom of other people, similar
Yes.
freedom of other people.
Yes.
Therefore, if you were to decide your interests by yourself, you better go to the moon. If you want to live in this society, your interest must be conditioned by the rest of the members of that society. And if their considered opinion is your choice must be circumscribed, then law is necessary.
Yes, I understand this.
Huh? So therefore, sometimes you may find it is unjust, it is unfair. I am an adult to decide whether I should smoke or not. But the rest of the society says, no, no, why are you putting all of us in as passive smokers? Your smoking is bad, you are a medical doctor, and if you smoke, what will your patients do? What will your children, your family do? They will also imitate you. And more smokers, more cancer. So why not we prohibit smoking? Why not we prohibit drinking, alcohol, drugs? Why not we prohibit more automobiles, pollution? Why? It's all for, you might like to have 6 automobiles in your family.
Yeah,
But-
but when is the boundary? I
Huh?
mean, we can prohibit everything. This is a question of boundary, where to stop.
Where
we,
to
can
s-
prohibit,
where
we,
to
can,
s-
we can prohibit vacation because people break their legs doing vacation.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, this is
We
the
can
question
prohibit,
of boundary.
we can prohibit anything if we collectively decide that is for public good. That is democracy.
That's horrible part of it.
We become
Well, the-
anti-democracy.
Yes. This is a debate, when you try to, in law, we are saying, why I am saying this, because this was not the problem during those days of monarchy, of emperors and kings. Others were, their commands were the laws. Law was the command of the sovereign at that time. The sovereign used to be some dictator, some monarch, some emperor, some feudal lord. But after the Second World War, when democracy became the norm for political organization, individual rights came to be recognized as limitations of state power. We found a new scenario in which the maximum happiness of the maximum number of people, laws decided collectively by elected representatives, which is the political will, people becoming the sovereign instead of those kings and emperors. You find a world of change as to what should be the legal domain, where should it not enter into. That's why it varies from state to state, varies from culture to culture. But in the process, we have this problem. Laws which are counterproductive, laws which have no purpose, no achieving, no objective. Why do you have it? Because the majority thinks it should be there. Is the majority becoming quite irrational, illogical? Yeah, you convince the majority. That's democracy, freedom of speech. But if you cannot abide by it, if you cannot abide by it, then face the consequences. So you find a legal order is a moral order that was partly historically, culturally conditioned, partly the attitude, the influence of science, influence of logic, influence of reasoning, influence of media, influence of education. You find a variety of opinion forming influences which impinge upon the existing law and the laws to be made, and you find legal system responding and changing according to the changing socio-economic political scenario. There becomes impact assessment very important, where law is supposed to reflect the collective will of the people. The process of public opinion making, the process of legislative opinion making, the method by which behavior could be impacted or controlled cannot be what Macaulay believed on pleasure and pain, because pleasure and pain is not uniform for different people. So therefore you have to have a better understanding of human nature to see as to what sort of desirable behavior you can evolve through appropriate incentives and disincentives. To give you an example, when we were having 80%, 85% income tax rate at a certain level, beyond that if you have more income, you have to pay 85% to the state. There was less amount of money collected. More people were induced to avoid payment of income tax. They concealed. And the state was not recovering enough tax because of higher level of taxation. One finance minister came and changed the law. And he said, look, this amount will be totally exempted. And this amount, I'll charge only 30%, no more. So from 85% it came down to 30%. More taxes, more taxpayers came forward. And we collected more taxes. I think that finance minister knew human nature and played up with it and had an effective economic law. Yes, sir.
So add here, because I completely agree with all this statement. I think the other important issue with possibly with people with the legal backgrounds sitting at higher hierarchy is that almost everything that they want to bring in the regulatory framework, which I think they look for a legal solution and at the same time the legal solution might not be helpful or appropriate. So there are different kind of problems which are economic problems and social problems, and everything you are trying to solve through a legislative framework, which may not be appropriate response. Let's say
no, there is no alternative. We believe in rule of law.
Yeah, but
So there has to be either a written law or understanding of law, because law is the only means known for behavioral change.
yes, but
The other mean is force, brute force.
But there-
We have abandoned it and we have adopted. So you may say that the laws are inappropriate, but don't say that there are other means other than law to influence behavior. I mean, in a family setup it may be different, but in the state versus citizen, in that relationship, if you believe in rule of law, which is the functional part of democracy, you necessarily have to have law if you want to change human behavior.
but actually what I wanted to give an example also. So maybe poverty is seen as a problem, but I see it is mostly an economic problem, not a legal problem.
No,
And
what I'm
if
saying-
through a legal framework
you are confusing.
try to people,
No, there is no legal problem. There is no legal problem. All problems are social, economic, political. Now those problems have to be resolved through the instrumentality of law. That's what the Constitution says, that is what democracy is about. So how do we structure a legal order that will create solve an economic problem, or solve a legal problem, or a political problem, or a social problem, or a family problem, or an education problem, or a health problem, or any problem, religious problem, will have to be through law only. Is there any method, other method? In a democracy, we are talking in the context of democracy and the rule of law.
But if you take the same example of tax, so even there could be more strict provision of regulatory framework saying no, even 80% you have to pay. But
No, that's strict provision.
policy.
That strict regulatory provision is the legal framework.
Right.
Law can be either a parliamentary law or a departmental administrative law or regulation.
Right.
The solution may come from economics.
Right.
The solution may come from medicine. The solution may come from anything. But we cannot put down to the throat by executive fiat. We have to legislate.
Yes.
We have to make a legal, because people have rights. If you do something outside the law, people will challenge the state. So the state has to defend itself by a law. So this law making will have to bear close relationship with human behavior with social, cultural facts. That nexus will have to be. That is where law is taken as a behavioral science. Law is considered as social engineering. Lawyers are considered as social engineers, or law as an instrument of building up a better society, an egalitarian order. So after this Second World War, that was what I was trying to say, the law-society relationship, the law-state relationship will have to be meaningfully understood in terms of impact. The impact of law on society and society's impact on lawmaking is both ways. You follow? It works both ways. The impact that we are intending to study will have to be law's impact on society and societal opinion, behavior, vices, good features, how much law accommodates it, which makes law successful. Otherwise, law will be counterproductive. So, that is why there is a constant nexus. Law is recognized as a behavioral science. Law is recognized if you want development, if you want eradication of poverty, if you want illiteracy to be eradicated, you have to have a Right to Education Act. And so long as it is delayed, society paid the price. Now the question is, how do you implement the Right to Education Act? That is why, the parliamentarians became wise. They felt that putting the parents in jail for not sending the child to the school, that was tried out. It did not function. Or punishing the teachers for not the student being absent in class, which will not help. And what's the best way? Give the implementation to the parent-teacher association, to the management of schools, to the teachers. There are a number of stakeholders. The civil society is in fact implementing or supposed to be implementing the right to education of the child. What can the state do? The state can provide the school buildings, the state can appoint teachers, the state can supply free educational materials, the state can provide midday meals, all other things the state can do. But actual education to the child will have to be done by parents in partnership with teachers, managements, panchayats, things like that. And all those people have been brought in as implementers under our newly enacted Right to Education Act. This is much learning exercise on the part of the lawmakers compared to 1960s, 70s, 80s, when laws were made by just criminalizing the conduct. And by criminalizing, nothing happened. Children were in child labor, schools there were no teachers, the Inspector Raj prevailed and bureaucracy grew, but children were not in school. There are problems. I am not saying that this has come to the ultimate solution. Now people are asking the question about quality. Even if the child goes to school, the teacher teaches, everything is there, but what is the quality of education that is being offered? Now can the state, by legislation, provide quality? What do you think? Everyone wants first-rate education as available in Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard. Can we pass a legislation that from tomorrow the standards maintained in the best of schools all over the world shall be implemented in every school in India? That legislation accomplished?
Well, it depends on how it is implemented. Because I think it really depends on the system how it is implemented. Because you have to install some kind of incentives for schools to be on a good quality. You cannot pass a law that quality is that. It's not going to work.
If you want to improve the quality of education in Indian schools, and if you want to accomplish it by legislation, what type of legislation will you pass?
I would allow parents to choose schools.
Okay, that's one method. Parents will be allowed to choose schools. So the best school will be crowded, and there the teachers, the management there will start hiking the fees. They will ask for capitation fee or donation, etc. if you want to come in. That means only the elite will be having good education. The rest, the state is worried. So what will the state do?
No, I wouldn't say that it could be a voucher system.
You know, the point is, if you give the right to choose your school,
Yeah.
many people will go to the best available. There are not many best available schools in any society. That's what the
But
state
there is
wants.
incentives for all schools to be better, because only those who are better are chosen.
So what is that incentive that you will give to the schools to become
Because if-
quality?
Because schools are funded according to the children that are studying in the schools.
So therefore, if the state will provide uniform funding to all schools,
It's
will
not
that
like-
solve the problem?
No, it's like every child has a voucher, and it can.
A student rather than schools. At the same time,
Yeah.
giving also this crowded school, which is providing quality, to open new branches. If you restrict the number of schools, then that would restrict the choice of parents as well.
So you want privatization of
No,
schools and open competition
No.
in schooling?
The government to have provision, but not becomes a provider.
You mean to say if the government doesn't become provider, quality will naturally come?
Yes,
Market is the solution.
No,
most possibly. Yes.
Okay. They think about it, you know, this is, everybody would love to have quality. Yes, sir, you have a
And I think we should get rid of all barriers to open the schools, because education service like barber service or designer service. So anyone who wants should open the school, and it doesn't depend on the premises. Even in a small room, one can open a school. If he can find clients, parents and students who will come to him, and parents will allow their children to get knowledge from this person, then it should be so. But you have to have a universal examination, and everyone can apply for this examination, and if he passes, he got his secondary education certificate.
Does it exist in your country, such a system?
No, absolutely not.
He says that let schooling, education, and we are talking about elementary education, be done by anybody, anywhere, under any conditions.
Yes.
And let the state's function is conduct a 10th standard or 12th standard examination, and anybody can.
It is not necessary.
What will happen? Will it maintain the quality? The quality is the state will look at the end of the schooling.
No, this examination may provide by an association of schools, for example. Like, you know that MBA is not like an association, and they accredit each MBA program.
You know, there is a right to equality. Every child has an equal right to get the best of education that's available. And therefore, if I want to join the best of school that is available in India, I must be enabled to do so by the state, because right to equality is a guaranteed right. Now, I am a poor person, I cannot afford to join that best school. There is an element of equity, social justice. So the state will have to see that either I am given this voucher or money or things like that to go over there, or those schools must be told that you cannot charge this much, you must charge only this which is reasonable. That means the state will have to interfere with all those people. Now suppose if those persons who are teaching, they are proselytizing, you know, or they are teaching something which the state thinks as antisocial. You are training terrorists. It will become a terrorist school. So can the state determine what is being taught?
Yes, absolutely. If the school teaches some aggression, then there is a Ministry of Affairs or Intelligence Services which can close the school.
Okay. So that means the state can come in the content of what is being taught.
Only
State can control the charges that are being imposed for imparting education.
State can only deal with the aggression, like any
No,
aggra-
suppose I'm a Catholic school, and I say only Catholics shall be allowed in my school, and I subscribe to secularism. I subscribe to equality, non-discrimination on the basis of religion. Or I say that I will admit only girls and not anybody.
Yeah, you
I
can.
think this is fine. In the US, there are a lot of Catholic schools that they get a lot of poor people. Poor people go to religious schools and they get really good education there.
So what I also wanted to add, in that case, the government can come up with a directive that what schools must not do rather than saying what all you need to do. So at the same time, wanted to make a point when we talk about the best and quality education. I don't think there is anything best or a standard. So even if tomorrow we think of having a standard of US in our school system, or later on of Finland or Sweden,
It's in a
also-
relative sense.
yes,
You know, that if you have to take a decision today,
right.
you know, you will rank some of them as the best school, some of them are good, some
Right.
of them are average, some of them, in that sense. We don't want to. But the purpose is quality. The purpose is equality. The purpose is quality, the purpose is equality, the purpose is equity, which are all guaranteed rights. And non-discrimination on the basis of gender, religion, caste, etc., which are again guaranteed rights. So state comes in all these areas. It is a major problem, at least in our country, which promises all these guaranteed rights, etc. So I'm just telling you the challenge of lawmaking, the need for impact assessment, the difficulties in studying impact assessment through a methodology which is universally acceptable, and at the same time having laws which many people consider as either unjust or impractical or unworkable, counterproductive, if you look into. But there is no simple answer unless and until the social sciences, the behavioral sciences methodology are imbibed by the legislative process, and you constantly change it, because there are changes happening in society by a variety of factors. Laws are always conservative, and if you want the law to keep in tune with the changes in society, you have to have a mechanism whereby the audit of legislations, call it social audit or whatever, happens periodically to update the law, particularly those laws which affect the common man. Those laws which affect only a small section of people, there will be lobbies in parliament which will update it according to the requirements of the lobbies. But for the common man, you will find unless somebody in civil society does the research and bring out the lacunae in the law which are acting against the common interest of the people who are intended beneficiaries of that law, you will find wide disparity between law in action and law in the books. And that is where the impact assessment becomes law impact assessment. I am now not talking about judicial impact assessment. I talked about judicial impact assessment from the perspective of the judiciary. There is a different social impact assessment of judgments. Many judgments of the Supreme Court of the country affect the society, sometimes adversely. And when it affects adversely, according to the assessment of the legislators, they go for an amendment of the law, whereby they nullify the judgment and bring out the legislation as they desire. We had many such examples of the Shah Banu judgment, where Muslim women were denied maintenance on divorce because the Muslim women follow the Muslim personal law, which says that if you give the meher That is enough, you don't have to give continued maintenance on divorce. The Supreme Court felt it is discriminatory. It is violative of right to equality, and it forces Muslim women to prostitution and other evils. Therefore, divorced Muslim women, irrespective of Islamic law, be given maintenance as other community women do have the right. When the Supreme Court passed that law, the Muslim group, some sections of the Muslim group felt that is invading into the right to religion or the right of minorities. And when they made noises, the representatives in Parliament, headed by the then Prime Minister, felt that it is the court has unauthorizedly entered into and made a decision which is adversely affecting the Muslims, their right to practice their religion. So the Muslim divorced women right to maintenance act was passed, whereby they said the rest of the law that the rest of the people have will not apply to Muslim divorced women, and they will continue to be governed by the maintenance provisions of the Islamic law. So that is, whether that is to the benefit of the women concerned, I do not know. Nobody did much research. But the idea that was given was religious freedom and minority rights were upheld. They were found to be more important than the maintenance rights of Muslim divorced women. This is a picture in my country. There are any number of such laws being passed, being amended, being declared unconstitutional by judicial review, by the courts, and then the Parliament stepping in. This is judicial impact assessment of a different kind. This is impact of judicial decisions on society. So that's also judicial impact. So you don't confuse judicial impact assessment. There are two types of judicial impact assessment. Number one, the impact on the judiciary, on the workload of the courts when a new law or an amendment to the law is passed. This is known as judicial impact assessment. The other kind of judicial impact assessment is when decisions of the court adversely affect society or what is considered good for society. Parliament steps in and nullifies that judicial impact assessment, the decision, by passing another law. That is also judicial impact assessment. Then there is law impact assessment, the type of which we discussed there. Only major thing, death penalty. There is a hue and cry. In our country we have death penalty for 6 offences. Now, more than 80 countries have abolished death penalty. There are people who believe that death penalty is violative of civil and political rights, and therefore it should be abolished. It should not find a place in the statute book. Now, how do you decide whether death penalty is desirable, not desirable? It serves a purpose in society without empirical research. Blindly saying that death penalty is not good. Why it is not good? Because you cannot give life, therefore you cannot take life. This argument nobody is willing to buy. There are countries powerful like China or America which maintains death penalty, kills hundreds of people to keep order and justice in society. Because there are reckless people who rape young children and kill them. And there are people who do it continuously, serial rapists. And in order to destroy the evidence, they kill the child also. If they are not to be killed, what other punishment should you give them? Keep them in prison for 100 years and keep them as state guests, feeding them, doing no work. And if there are overcrowding in the jail by such people and they create violence within the jail, what do you do? So there are people who say that death penalty is desirable. It is necessary for society to survive. Because few miscreants like this, it happens in America quite often. A dropout of a school goes to his school and kills a dozen children. Every year we read the newspapers. He has access to firearms, and there are children who go to school with firearms. It has started happening in India also. Recently in Madras, a child who was in the school, when the teacher admonished him, he took next day he brought a knife and then stabbed the teacher and killed her. That's the end of it. The child can stab, but of course our Juvenile Justice Act says that the child cannot be a criminal at all. He has to be reformed, he has to be corrected. So even if he commits murder of his own parents or teacher, he cannot be called a criminal or treated as a criminal. That's a different philosophy altogether. What I am saying is, imprisonment is no punishment for many people in society today. Particularly in countries like India where there is a lot of poverty, some prisoners, I saw in the television the other day, prisoners telling that life in the jail is so happy here, food at the right time, sleep for 8 hours, television, newspaper, I would not like to go out of jail, he says. Because out of jail I have to work hard and I do not know whether I will get work, life is here good. So prison is no more deterrent. Death is no more deterrent. What's the punishment that you can give to deter people from committing crimes? Some people say that don't have any criminal law. Abolish crimes. Then there will be no criminal. Decriminalize. Anybody for that?
Yeah, we are for decriminalizing drugs. We are for decriminalizing drugs taking.
Yeah, drug taking decriminalize. Slowly decriminalize other offences also. So that
smuggling as well, because we are for zero customs duties.
Prostitution.
Yeah.
prostitution may be decriminalized. Attempt to suicide may be decriminalized. So what is left? So
Killing.
A lot is left.
and what is
A
left?
lot is
Yes,
left.
yes.
No, but the point is, if you criminalize, ultimately spending all the money for prosecution and things like that, the so-called criminal is happy there. He is a state guest.
Who is the state guest?
So the prisoner.
Why don't they work?
There is a provision for working too.
What work will you do? And what work do you want to convert the jail into a factory and install the or is there any guarantee that he will not commit a crime within the jail? There are so many who are committing. If he is taken out of the jail, of the cell, he is prone to violence. So therefore, will you let him work with other prisoners on whom he will show his muscle power? There are so many problems, when the question is necessity of law in a rule of law society, civilized instrument, we all admit. But we find by this impact assessment that punishment are no more deterrent to many sections. Some people, yes. And the only punishment that we know of is death, imprisonment, fine. Fine for a poor person, no problem, no way. He has to go to jail. Jail for a poor person, very good, he is happy. So death, they say that it is violative of human rights. So earlier we used to have transport them to Australia or to Andamans. But now Australians are the former inmates of jails. are now the richest and wealthiest people. So therefore the question is transportation to another place, no more workable. Unless you want to transport to Siberia or transport to moon or something like that. I shift this impact assessment with that. I only conclude one more thing where impact assessment has done some social good, where some studies have contributed, that is the environmental impact assessment, which is now legislated by the Environment Protection Act. So in the matter of town planning, in the matter of urban development, in the matter of important energy installations, etc., impact assessment of all industrial activity, impact assessment is now stipulated. And there are definitive methodologies as to how much environmental damage or pollution that an industry or a structure might cause, and how to countervail it and make the cost on the polluter pays principle, etc. Anyway, impact assessment has become a part of environmental science and engineering, and it is legislated under the Environment Protection Act. So this is one area which has absorbed the cost of the impact on the basis of scientific studies in most of the countries. We are now trying to go globally in the matter of impact assessment, environmental impact assessment relating to climate change, so that is shared by the countries of the world together, which is all scientific studies. So impact assessment that way, if not in those areas we talked about, it's happening in another area which is critical for survival for living organisms in this earth. I am now in the remaining time open to any questions that you might ask, either in impact assessment or outside it, in the area of law and governance.
The first question is just, I wanted to know about that assessment report, whether it would be possible to read for us or any electronic copy.
Yes.
I don't know, I have this one copy. If Madhu will take and ensure that within a week it will be available at my house by courier, then I can leave it with you. I think it may be in the website of the Department of Justice. Check it. There are 2 volumes. I got only 1 volume.
I have downloaded it.
Okay.
So you can download on YouTube. I have already downloaded.
All right, that's there. So that will be and the second volume consists of 2 important studies with all its methodological processes. So if you want to repeat it, reputed economists and political scientists and statisticians have given the methodology from A to Z in the 2 studies in volume 2. So that will be.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So, as I understand, you were a little bit criticizing this notion of pleasure and pain in the. I have written this, that impact assessment should not be grounded on the rationale of pleasure and pain. It should be grounded on something universal. And I have a little doubt or some problem with that. So, could you specify what do you call by saying universal? Because if you are saying that pleasure and pain is something which is really subjective, then everything is subjective. The problem itself that you're trying to solve is also subjective. It might be a problem for one person, not a problem for one person. So is it democracy then the only way what you say what is universal? Because it's then, it's blurry a little bit.
Well, not universal, that's not the right, but the pleasure and pain principle which still holds good, but in a very primitive way. You know, the pleasure-pain principle as the basis of legislation, which was adopted by Jeremy Bentham and other English philosophers, that was at the time of the 18th century when science has given us some idea about human nature, human behavior. But since 18th century, the last 3 centuries, lot of scientific research on human nature and behavior have given us a better understanding of human nature than the oversimplistic calculation of pleasure and
You should keep in mind.
Firstly-
These can be
Firstly, the Indian experience cannot be compared with any others. We are so diverse, not merely ethnic diversity, but otherwise also. Secondly, we are too big to be compared with any other country. Too big, population-wise, territory-wise, diversity-wise. But in the conception of a constitution, let me first of all say a constitution is just the beginning. You know, a constitution is an organic, living thing. It grows.
yes.
So therefore, don't take that a constitution that Nepal adopted in 2012 is to be ever continuing in that way. The constitution may continue, but its complexion, its character, its application will keep on changing. Now therefore, the relations between the states and the federal government cannot be set forever. But at the same time, when there is so much of diversity, you have to necessarily have a federal system and no other. A federal only means that power is divided between the center and the states. Power is divided. That is the only meaning of a federal arrangement. Now, how much of power is with the center? How much of power with the states? That's a matter which you have to decide by debate and discussion. There is no other way. But you do know that this division will have to happen in terms of finance, in terms of administration, in terms of lawmaking. So what India has done, if you were to learn from India's experience, India decided that, of course, like any other federation, we have decided external affairs, communications, defense. This must necessarily have with the federal government. No state can, individual province can take care of the defense of Nepal, or the external affairs of Nepal, or the communications system in Nepal. Now, leaving these three areas, what other areas you should give to the center? Now, you will find, administratively speaking, it is easy for the revenue to be collected by a central mechanism than by 11 or 14 state mechanisms. So, collection of revenue on whatever items you want to tax, leaving some local items, entertainment, housing, etc., etc. A more effective taxing arrangement can be centralized rather than localized. Of course, having collected this revenue, what will the center do? It has to come back to the states. So you have to think of a mechanism as to how the revenue collected by the center will devolve to the states. This is where you have to have an arrangement which have to be reviewed, maybe year to year, 5 years, 10 years. We have what is called a finance commission in the constitution, which will decide, yes, center will collect 80% of all revenues in the whole of Nepal, including the revenues by way of foreign aid. But when you collect it, 70% of it will be going to the states. Only 10% you will keep. This 70% will go according to this formula. Backward states, poor states which have no revenue, local revenue available, or some sense of equality in terms of population, in terms of administrative responsibilities in those states. There are some issues which have to be locally discussed either through the Finance Commission or through a Center State Commission, Interstate Council. You must decide, not once for all, maybe once every 2 years, every 5 years, as you decide, to review the method of tax collection and tax devolution, keeping the minimum which is required for defense of the country, for external affairs of the country, for communication system of the country with the center, the rest must come to the states, which have the responsibility of law and order, of health, education, housing, employment, so many other things, water, sanitation, everything is the state responsibility. So the state will have the legislative power of all these items of welfare. The center will have legislative power on central taxation or central revenue, and then defense, external affairs, communication, things like that. This is a federal scheme. And if you don't appreciate this mechanism of devolution and division, which cannot be set by the Constitution. Constitution can only devise a mechanism, an instrument. But it has to be started after the Constitution is adopted, through that mechanism. It can be an interstate council, it can be a commission for centers and states, or it can be a finance commission every 5 years. It can be like that. And there must be a judiciary which will settle the disputes which might arise, which cannot be resolved by discussion and consultation. The judiciary will settle it. This is a federal scheme which has to be imbibed. I suppose the constitution makers have understood it. And the question was, how many states? Now I understand in today's paper I read that some parties are saying that there are 80 ethnic groups and there must be 80 ethnic territories.
And the idea of the nomenclature, naming of all the states. So how important is that? Because half the war is on, yes, we want to name the places. This
Name, you may say Nepal A, Nepal B, Nepal C. It is a name is immaterial.
Half of the political discussion that I go through the newspapers is on the ideas of let's name the state this.
Yeah, yes. Name, if you, it's better left to the states, the provinces. You have some name which you want, Bhagirathi, Godavari, whatever you want to, in the name of, or Himalaya, or whatever you may name, it's immaterial. It's an ethnic name or a religious name. It makes no sense to argue on that. But the crucial thing is, on what basis are you going to get the money that is available? That is basis on which, if you discriminate one province against the other province, which are irrational, then there will be fight. So you have to have a mechanism, because you are a democracy. So it must be debate and discussion and consensus building. But for which you have to have a forum. What is that forum? You have to provide it in the Constitution. So that is about it. I also discussed with the Constituent Assembly about the judiciary being independent. There are initially some opinions saying, no, the Parliament should appoint the judges. My view was it was dangerous. There is no independence of judiciary. If the judiciary is accountable to Parliament. So therefore, if you do not have an independent judiciary, then rule of law will be in jeopardy. A majoritarian Parliament can do anything. So if you want to avoid a majoritarian Parliament can be a dictatorship, as we had during emergency of Indira Gandhi. So if you have a majority in Parliament, you can do anything and everything. That is for the British Parliament, not anymore in our country. So you have to have an independent judiciary which will ensure that the Parliament acts within the power given to it by the Constitution. So judicial review will have to be an inherent part of it. Judicial appointments, yes, the Parliament may have a say in. So let the Parliament pass a legislation which will determine the quality, the eligibility for judicial selection, the process, transparent, etc. Parliament can pass a law, but Parliament should not be appointing judges, nor the executive. There must be a joint forum by which can be basis of a law. That was another important point which was discussed. From the Indian experience, all that you have to say is India believes in democracy, and I don't think any other country in the world can be as democratic as India. It is proved to be very effective. I have read a book, I have often said, of a Princeton University professor who was watching the Indian elections. After 7th general election, he wrote a book published from Princeton University, where he said India will not see elections after the 10th general election. There will be fight, there will be booth capturing, there will be violence, there will be all sorts of things. With the result, democracy will not survive in India. We had the 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 general elections, smooth transfer of power, 250 national parties and more than 800 regional parties. We have elections in panchayats of 3-level panchayats. With the result, we have 1 million representatives. No other country in the world have 1 million elected representatives. And our free and fair election is now acknowledged. Our election commission is sought after for telling other countries how to conduct fair and free elections. So therefore, of course, there are a lot of election malpractices, that's a different matter. But have you an effective method of control of it? So therefore, what Nepal people, particularly in the politics, will have to take it is, democracy is no doubt the best form of government. And for the evils of democracy, the solution is more democracy. Even if it is abused as license by some people, but still, don't try to curb the freedom of the press. Don't try to curb the independence of the judiciary. Don't try to silence the opposition by using strong arm methods. Liberal democracy, with all its vices, may not achieve quick progress, but that's a price worth paying. History teaches us that it is better to be slow in development, but with the consensus of the people. And that is something which India has learned, which India would like to share with all other countries. Democracy will create a lot of problems for you. Democracy will slow down your progress and development. But if you have faith in the people, stick to democracy. And democracy is not just one model. There can be many models of democracy. We are told that China is also democratic. But you elect only the communists and whoever is put up by the party. That is, whereas, if you look into this state, Kerala, the cabinet has minorities, majority. The majority in terms of religion, if you look into, the majority of people in Kerala who are the Hindus, they are a minority in the government. Muslims have 5 ministers, Christians have how many? 7 ministers, or some other minority. With the result, the Hindus have only 7 ministers in a cabinet of 21. How did it come? It's a magic of democracy. So the minorities have no grounds. It is democratic. Majority cannot be having a grounds because it's democracy. If you, the majority, can persuade people of your religion, persuade it, but within the confines of secularism. Well, that is a free play of democracy. Nobody has a grounds, and we play the game according to the rules of the game. This is what is wanted, so that we don't fight and put an end to democracy and rule of law in the process. Which is what, with great strides in Nepal you have accomplished. Therefore, it is people like you, propagate it, speak freely. Maoists also have to live. So long as they agree to lay down arms and don't play the game with arms, fine. You agree? You are from Nepal?
Yes. We are from Nepal.
Okay.
Do you think democracies are viable in very, very little countries? My country is 3 million people.
That is the most viable in a democracy. You have heard the Aristotle's and Greek democracies?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
In fact, we are trying to do it here. We have cut down the country into small panchayats. And at Gram Panchayat, every member sits down and governs. This is units of self-government. So we have, how many panchayats? A million panchayats? No.
6 lakh. Yes.
No, in the whole of India, maybe
6 lakhs. 6 lakhs.
6 lakh panchayats.
Or 6 lakhs.
They are self-governing units.
But 6 lakhs governments.
6 lakh government.
That's right. See, our democracy is very tolerant and accommodating.
Yeah.
And probably even I think the Americans cannot claim to be so democratic as we are.
Exactly.
Their election commission, you see, I don't think they have a national election commission. Do they have? I don't think so. I don't think. The state executive, you know,
Yeah,
they can
state
manipulate.
executive. Yeah, that's right.
That's how President Bush, you know, he won the election. Not in India.
Yeah.
The Indian election commission is very independent.
Yeah, absolutely.